After an impressive day at work, a car salesman named Dan heads home to meet his wife Jessica and his 3 kids, Nina, Kyle, and Max. As he enters the house, he meets Jessica arguing with Nina over her preferred college, which she wants to change from Stanford to a school in Iowa so she can be with her boyfriend Trevor. Jessica tells Dan to interfere, but he just says that they need to stop fighting. He then faces Kyle and asks how things are going and if he's making any new friends. Kyle doesn't seem so happy, and he complains about how Dan banned him from playing video games. Dan says he only did it so that Kyle can make some friends. However, Kyle still doesn't care, and he says he's going to see one of his friends named Samir. Kyle then leaves the house and meets with Samir, who gets paid so that his friend can play games in his garage. Elsewhere, Dan and Jessica head out for their anniversary date at a park. As they're on a roller coaster, Jessica complains about feeling stuck in the city instead of always traveling around like she wants. Dan says it's because they have kids and that she shouldn't worry about it too much. Shortly after, they enjoy a fun time on the roller coaster, after which they decide to head home. Before they leave, though, a boy takes their picture while they're kissing. Dan sees this and immediately confronts the boy, but he gets insulted and also watches as the picture gets posted online. The boy also pours his drink on Dan, and even though he's really pissed, he remains calm and eventually leaves with Jessica. The next day, while at the gym, Jessica hits the punching bag so hard that a lady named Gwen notices her. Gwen asks if she's okay, and Jessica says she's just having a tough time with her daughter. Shortly after, Gwen properly introduces herself to Jessica and says she's only in town to see her ex. She also adds that because she runs a travel agency, she doesn't stay in one place for long. As they continue their training, Gwen doesn't look too good at it, but Jessica tries to show her how it's done. In the process, Jessica mistakenly punches Gwen. She eventually says sorry for that, and before they head separate ways, Gwen gives Jessica her card in case she wants to travel in the future. Elsewhere, Dan takes Max with him to go shopping for some items. While at it, he notices that a strange man is following him. Not long after, the man attacks him, but Dan appears to be very good at fighting, even though he's still carrying Max. After a long fight, Dan beats up the man and eventually leaves. He heads straight home and opens a secret stash where he picks out a bag with guns, passports, and cash. He sees that the passports have expired, so he calls a man named Augie, who sounds surprised to hear Dan calling him. Dan says he needs passports for himself and his family because his past has come back to get him. It turns out that Dan was an assassin in the past, and he used to work with Augie for the same organization. However, after a fallout with their boss, they've been hiding for 18 years. Augie asks Dan how he was found, and he says it might have been on social media. Dan then offers Augie a lot of money to make the passports and meet him in Las Vegas. Augie asks why he wants Las Vegas, and Dan says it's the only safe place he can go because his family still doesn't know his past. Augie is shocked to hear this, but Dan says he'll tell them at the right time. With this, Dan packs a few things and checks the family's weekly planner to see where his kids will be. Following this, he leaves the house with Max and heads to pick up Nina first. Even though it takes a while before he sees her, Dan then asks where Kyle is. After she tells the truth about Kyle's frequent trips to Samir's house, Dan heads over there only to see that his son is actually there to play games. Despite being pissed, he tells the kids to enter the car because he's taking the family to Las Vegas on a road trip. The kids are shocked by how sudden it is, but Dan says they have to get Jessica next. After he arrives at Jessica's workplace, he tells her about his plan, and even though she thinks it's impromptu, she agrees to go. On their way out, Dan spots a suspicious black car at the entrance, so he takes a different route. As he sees that he's still being followed, he keeps driving so fast that his family don't understand what's going on. After a while, Dan notices that there's a tracker on his car, so he takes his family to his workplace. He enters the garage and explains to Jessica that he needs to check under the car to ensure everything is okay before their road trip. Even though Jessica doesn't get this, Dan uses a machine to lift the car, after which he removes the tracker and puts it on his co-worker's car, which then becomes the target for the mercenaries. Just then, Dan leaves for Las Vegas with his family. On the way, he sees Jessica taking a picture, and because he thinks she might post it, he takes her phone as well as that of the kids and throws them outside. His family is shocked by this, but he says he did it so they can have more bonding time. However, he soon realizes that he needs a map to travel since he's now without phones in the car. He eventually stops at an office where he bribes an official to get what he wants in no time. They then continue their journey but eventually stop at a motel to spend the night. In the parking lot, Kyle seems restless, and Nina says it's because he's not playing games. As they argue about it, a girl recognizes Kyle from his gaming streams, and because she's a fan, she asks for a picture. Meanwhile, Dan is able to get 2 rooms for his family to spend the night. However, when he gets outside and sees that Kyle just took a picture with someone who might post it, he lies that all the rooms have been booked and they have to leave. Elsewhere, Dan's old boss, McCaffrey, has already found Dan's house, After checking around for a while, he calls several groups of mercenaries to go after Dan. Shortly after, Dan notices that he's being followed again. Luckily, everyone in the car except Max is sleeping with their headphones on, so Dan manages to kill the bad guys silently. As the last guy dies, Jessica wakes up and asks what's happening, but Dan says there was a bump on the road. He then continues driving until he reaches Iowa. When Jessica and the kids wake up, they're left shocked by how fast he probably drove. But since they're in Iowa, Nina suggests going to see the college she wants to pick. Jessica doesn't think it's a good idea because it's an excuse to see Trevor. However, Dan supports Nina, so he takes the family there. While on campus, Jessica remembers how college used to be for her as a decathlete. Shortly after, one of the students dares her to do a keg stand, and Jessica does so well that her family is left impressed. Following this, Dan gets them to join a group of people touring the school. While on the tour, Nina says sorry to Kyle for telling Dan about Samir's garage setup. She says she did it because she feels he gets away with so much while everyone thinks she's doing things because of Trevor. Later on, while still on tour, Dan spots a German with a strange tattoo walking with the group. Dan suspects that he could be one of McCaffrey's men, so he tries to speak with the man, but Jessica sees him. She asks what's going on, and he says he's just chatting with the man. As she then hears him speak German, she looks shocked, though he says he learned it a while ago. After she leaves, Dan discovers that the man is innocent, but one of McCaffrey's men then shows up and tries to kill him. Dan immediately finds somewhere to hide, but after a while, he kills the man. Following this, he looks for his family and tells them to leave, but Jessica says that Nina went to see Trevor. However, this doesn't go well as she finds him cheating on her. As she returns to the car, Dan sees that she's not happy. Instead of giving her some dad advice, he teaches her a martial art technique, which she can use to hurt Trevor. With this, she returns to meet Trevor and leaves him in pain, after which she gets back to the car looking happy. After a while, they make yet another stop, and Dan calls Augie to ask if his package is ready. Augie says he's already through and he's bringing it to Las Vegas. He then asks if Dan has told his family the truth, but he says hasn't. Just as Dan sits down in a restaurant to plan how he'll tell his wife, Kyle sees him and asks who he's talking to. Dan says it's nothing, and he also starts talking with his son. Shortly after, the family continues their trip until they get to Vegas. They look excited to finally arrive at their destination, and they even get happier when they see their room. Shortly after, Dan leaves them and goes to meet Augie. Dan collects the passports and pays up his old friend, who then tells him to be careful. Dan then returns to the room and keeps a gun and knife with him as he leaves for a dinner date with Jessica. On their way out, they tell the kids to stay indoors, but Nina and Kyle do the exact opposite when their parents are away. They head to a gaming arena called HyperX, where Kyle recognizes a popular gamer named Ren. As he introduces himself, Ren recognizes him and asks if he wants to meet some other gamers. Kyle agrees to do this, and after a while, he even gets picked to play for Ren's team in a game. Meanwhile, Dan tries to tell Jessica about his past life, but she keeps interrupting him. When a waiter also comes over to meet the couple, while he's about to tell her, Dan gets pissed and starts lamenting in French. Jessica looks shocked, and Dan says it's another language he picked up in school. Even though Jessica is concerned that he's just telling her, she admires how well he speaks. After a while, Dan decides to call the kids, but when they don't answer the phone, he tells Jessica that they need to go back to their room. When they get up, they check the rooms and find the kids sleeping. However, it turns out the kids have stuffed several things on their bed to make it look like they're still there. While Jessica then leaves for her room, Dan checks around to make sure they're safe. Before he can join her in the room, McCaffrey's men are already around, and they start shooting at Dan. He defends himself and kills 2 of the men in the process. However, the last guy gets hold of Jessica and threatens to kill her. He also adds that if Dan does anything funny, his kids will be killed at HyperX. Dan then drops his gun and sneakily picks the knife in his sock as he tells the guy to leave Jessica because she doesn't know about his past. Before the guy can say much, Dan kills him, and Jessica cannot believe everything that just happened. As they check for the kids, Dan and Jessica realize that they're truly at HyperX. On their way, Jessica asks for an explanation for what happened, and Dan tells her the truth about his past. She sounds very disappointed because he has always kept it from her, but he says he never got a good chance to tell her. Elsewhere, Kyle wins the game for Ren's team, and just as the crowd cheers for him, his parents arrive at the arena. Dan immediately tells the kids to head out, but they start asking questions. Jessica then tells Dan to tell them the truth. As Dan talks about his past, the kids think he's joking until one of McCaffrey's men tries to shoot them. They eventually run away, but after a while they stop to express their disappointment at Dan for just telling them. He says sorry to them, but they're not ready to listen. He then keeps them safe and kills a bad guy in front of them. They remain shocked, but it doesn't stop them from escaping before another guy shows up. Shortly after, they stop at a motel, and there, the kids are angry about their dad's past. He gives them the passports Augie made, but they don't take it well because it means they'll start their lives again. After they walk away and tell Dan to forget about them, he says sorry to Jessica and tries to get her to be on his side. However, she also can't take it because she thinks his marriage to her is all part of his plan to stay hidden. After she leaves and joins the kids in the room, Jessica calls Gwen to ask if she can arrange a flight for her and the kids. In the morning, Jessica leaves with the kids and tells Dan to forget about them. Shortly after, they get to where Gwen asked to meet up, only to see a really big plane. Just then, Gwen comes down from it and tells Jessica to come in with her kids. After they get in, Gwen starts talking about her ex and how she met the woman he left her for. As she mentions that she found a way to secretly get closer to his new girl, Jessica realizes that Gwen is talking about her. She tries to get the kids to leave, but it's too late as McCaffrey shows up and commends Gwen for her work. She then says she doesn't really care about Jessica and the kids because all she wants is Dan. Following this, McCaffrey calls Dan to inform him that Jessica and the kids are now his hostages. He also gives him a location to come over if he wants to see his family again. Dan doesn't hesitate to go there, and at the entrance of the place, a man named Spiros comes over to get him. A while later, Dan finally meets McCaffrey, and his family is left shocked when he refers to his old boss as his dad. Jessica looks disappointed because it's another thing Dan didn't tell her. Just then, McCaffrey says that after seeing how Dan killed his men over the past few days, he was very impressed. He tells Dan to come back to work for him, but he rejects the offer immediately. As McCaffrey then threatens to kill his family, Dan chooses to return to his old job. Following this, McCaffrey tells Spiros to take Dan's family outside. On the way, the kids are touched by what their dad did, so they tell Jessica to do something to help him. Jessica is still annoyed at Dan, and she says she's not helping him. However, she eventually changes her mind and pushes Spiros down the stairs. Jessica and the kids then head back up to help Dan. There, McCaffrey and his men decide to leave as Gwen tries to seduce Dan. While doing this, she's unaware that his family is already back in the room. He pretends to play along for a while, but he only uses this to knock her out. McCaffrey's tech guy is also caught, and after he's tied up, Kyle takes control of his drone. Dan then says sorry to Jessica for not telling her about his past earlier. He also adds that she and the kids mean a lot to him. After this, he takes the drone and sees that McCaffrey is returning to the building with his men after discovering that Dan has freed himself. Dan then tells Jessica and the kids to head to the top of the building while he takes on McCaffrey and his men, with Kyle using the drone as his extra eyes. Following this, Jessica and the kids head up while Dan prepares for the fight. After a while, he shows up and starts killing McCaffrey's men one after the other. McCaffrey also notices that Dan is using the drone to his advantage, so he communicates with Gwen to find Jessica and the kids. After freeing herself, Gwen heads up, and as Jessica sees that someone is coming, she tells the kids to hide. As Gwen gets to the top, Jessica starts fighting with her. Even though she fights hard, Jessica takes a beating from Gwen. Meanwhile, Dan continues his killing spree, and out of anger, McCaffrey shoots down the drone. With only his father left, Dan tries to outsmart him, but he gets beaten. Back at the top, Jessica is badly hurt. But before Gwen can do anything else, Nina tries to knock her off the building, but she still hangs on. As she's then about to hurt the kids, Jessica attacks Gwen, but she gets overpowered again. Despite this, Jessica channels her inner athlete and throws a long stick to kill Gwen and leave her kids shocked. Elsewhere, Dan continues to fight well against McCaffrey, but just as he falls, his dad picks up a gun and tries to kill him. Before he takes the shot, Jessica and the kids get there in time. Nina then begs her grandfather to have mercy on Dan. McCaffrey looks interested in the conversation at first, but as he says he doesn't care, it turns out to be too late, as Dan is able to knock him out when he's distracted. Following this, Dan looks happy to be back with his family. Shortly after, the police arrive at the hotel, and McCaffrey is arrested. 6 months later, Nina is credited as the main reporter for a story that uncovers McCaffrey's entire criminal operation. Elsewhere, Dan now owns a security firm, where Augie works as a trainer. After he leaves work that day, Dan watches Jessica as she's training some college students on the school field. A while later, they head home together to pick up their kids before embarking on another road trip to drop Nina off at Stanford.